And I will start us off. I am Sarah from Mass Climate Action. And tonight I am joined by my colleagues from the Sierra Club, Veena and Jacob.
Folks, I know a lot of you, but not everybody. Jacob Stern, Deputy Director at Mass Sierra Club, he and him pronouns. And just a quick reminder, I know folks are just joining, but if you encourage folks to stay muted since we have over 30 people on the call, we want to make sure folks can hear us. Veena, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Jacob. Hi, everyone. My name is Veena Dharmaraj. I'm the Director of Transportation at Sierra Club, and I'm so excited to have all of you on the call today.
And maybe we'll just give it like 30 more seconds for folks to join. I'm going to pull up the slides right now. Great. And for folks who are just joining, if you want to put your name or your pronouns, oh, Sarah just put it in the chat again, but put your name, pronouns, and organizational affiliation in the chat. It'd be great. Say hello. We're not going to have time for introductions tonight. All right, we can probably get started here. Once again, I'm Jacob, and I am going to be kicking us off here. Just a couple quick logistical notes. We are recording tonight because we want to be able to share this out. So wish us luck and hope we don't say the wrong thing here. We are not going to be stopping too much for questions along the way, but we will be monitoring the chat, my co-presenters and I. So if you have a question or something that makes sense, please throw it in the chat. And we will be taking questions at the end. But we'll be flying through a lot of content, so we want to make sure we can get through all of that for folks on the call. We expect this will be about an hour-and-a-half presentation, and we will not be taking a break or anything in the middle. We're going straight through. I think that's probably it for logistics. Bathrooms are at the end of the hallway on the right. Sorry. Missing a time where we were in person. Okay, so let's kick this off. This event is hosted by Mass Sierra Club, MCAN, and Mass Power Forward. We really want an opportunity to talk about the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan with a lot of folks in Mass Power Forward, or folks who we hadn't had a chance to have that conversation with in the past. This is an opportunity to do so. So I'm going to dive right in. And before we get into it, just a reminder, this is some of the many groups that are working on the CECP, not an exhaustive list, too many logos, but I just want to be clear that we're not the only people advocating around this. Many allies that are part of Mass Power Forward and not part of Mass Power Forward who are also engaging. So what we're going to talk about tonight, we are going to do a dive into some of the policy background. And
not right now.
Reminder, folks could stay muted if possible.
Popcorn later? Is that your?
Let's talk about the policy background. We're going to talk very briefly about the 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap and the purpose of the CECP. And then we're going to dive into some of the highlights of the CECP and what we see as some recommended changes. There's a public comment period that's open now, which will lead us right into our actionable next steps. So very basic start. Why do we care about the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan, or the CECP? Very simple. It's going to heavily dictate clean energy and climate policy in the next 10 years, which we know are the most significant for combating climate change. And it's going to impact all aspects of our state economy, including the electric transportation and building sector. So it's really going to touch
our
economy here in Massachusetts. And lastly, a big takeaway is that even Governor Baker, his administration agrees, a net zero by 2050 goal is extremely doable. We'll talk more about that in a second. So I always like to show this slide just to kind of remind us of the stakes we're facing here. Climate change isn't something that's going to come at some faraway date. We're already experiencing some of the impacts now, and unfortunately will continue to in the coming years and decades. So these are just some recent scary pictures. The top right is last summer when we could see the smoke from California wildfires in Massachusetts skies. So just some background here. This is my favorite section, so I'm a huge nerd. But a thing to know, so understanding where the CECP came from, the first thing to be aware of is this law right here, the Global Warming Solutions Act. And I imagine many folks are familiar with this, this law. It was a seminal piece of legislation passed, was it now 13 years ago? Very significant bill. It committed the state to reduce greenhouse gases by 25% by 2020 and 80% by 2050. Really groundbreaking in many ways. It really set up the path for where we are today in terms of state climate policy. But just moving on quickly. So following the passage of the GWSA in 2008, there were a couple judicial challenges to it. This one's really interesting. I really recommend Googling this if you aren't familiar with it. But essentially, the Kane versus Mass DEP case was a result of years of inaction since the GWSA had passed. So it was passed in 2008, and the Baker administration just really hadn't done much to implement it. There hadn't been many policies to actually reduce emissions. So these high school students brought suit against the state government, claiming their inaction had put future generations in jeopardy. And the Supreme Judicial Court, the SJC, actually ruled that not only did the Massachusetts DEP have to meet the letter of the law, but they actually had to meet the intention as well, which is to achieve, quote, actual, measurable, and permanent emissions reductions. And so again, there was another lawsuit brought against Mass DEP, this time from the New England Power Generators Association in 2018. This is more recent. Some folks might remember this. Basically saying that DEP did not have authority to set carbon emissions targets for the electric sector. It was kind of the opposite, trying to weaken the GWSA with this lawsuit. And again, the SJC upheld the power of the Global Warming Solutions Act and said that not only does DEP have the power to set emissions targets, but they're actually required to promulgate new regulations in post-2020 to meet the new, to meet in yet to be set interim targets. So in both cases, the SJC, in both cases, the SJC expanded upon the power of the Global Warming Solutions Act and had made the law much stronger. And also just seeing some feedback that some folks can't access the chat. I'm really not sure why that is, but I think I can fix it.
Jacob, according to Paul, according to somebody on the call, I think folks on this call can only chat the hosts.
Yeah, I think I just fixed the setting. Does someone want to give it a try and do a little test chat? I'm not sure why that got, there we go. I'm not sure how that happened, y'all. We don't mess with that feature, so sorry about that, but hopefully it's fixed. Great. Okay. So moving right along, I'm going to skim over this one. These are other important climate policies. Some of the other bills and regulations that were passed in the last decade or so. I'll just draw your attention to the bottom one, the Next Generation Roadmap. We're going to talk a little bit about how this interacts with the CECP, but it's going to make things more complicated. Is the short answer, but mostly in a good way. So, and then I just want to show, this is the Governor Baker's EA. They came up with this chart of our emissions by sector. So remember I said the CECP will touch on all the major sectors. This just shows where our emissions come from in different sectors. And I think there's like two big takeaways from this chart. One is that we've made some gains in the electric sector, in the sense that electric emissions have gone down. That's partially from a switch to gas as an electric generating fuel source, which is not great. But we have made some gains, energy efficiency and renewables. And the transportation and buildings have remained pretty consistent. Actually, I believe in 2018, our transportation emissions actually went up, which this only goes till 2017. So it doesn't quite capture that jump. We have a lot of work to do, basically. So, and I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about the decarbonization roadmap. Sorry if you can hear in the background, there's a dog looking for attention. But the decarbonization roadmap is kind of the other piece of the CECP. This is a collection of reports compiled by the Baker administration's Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, EEA, which looked at strategies to get to net zero. And they had 8 different pathways that they looked at. Each one of them got the state to net zero with slightly different parameters. Basically, my big takeaway here is that it's very possible. And there are lots and lots of strategies that we can implement to reduce our emissions. There's a few of them here, and we're going to talk about a lot more in a minute. And so this is a graphic that was I took from the roadmap study. I actually recommend, if folks are looking for more bedtime reading, the executive summary of the roadmap study is very readable. This is where our energy fuel comes from and where our energy generation comes from, and where the Baker administration sees it, how the Baker administration sees it changing in 2050. So on the left side, that's basically our building and transportation sectors. A lot of our energy comes from gasoline and pipeline gas, methane gas, essentially, with electricity taking over an ever increasing share of our energy fuel. And then on the right side, this is how we generate power. So this is, right now in 2020, it's mostly gas. Imports would be mostly hydro from Canada. That's what that means. And solar and wind coming on board throughout the next few decades. And I should be clear, this isn't what I necessarily want our pathway to be. But I think it's helpful to look at the Baker administration's vision for the future. And it's not completely out of sync with what I want, but there are some issues, and we'll talk about some of our recommendations in the CECP in a few minutes. All right, so here we're getting into the meat of it here. We're going to talk now in depth about the Clean Energy Plan itself. So per the Global Warming Solutions Act, remember we talked about all that legal precedent, the Baker administration is required to publish a CECP every 5 years. So there will be a 2035 CECP and a 2040 CECP, et cetera, to try and hit our emissions reductions target. And the Baker administration has listed a 45% reduction in emissions as their goal for 2030. That goal might be changing based on some pending legislation to 50%, but the CECP was written around that 45% goal. So the CECP is essentially like a laundry list of policies across different sectors of how to reduce emissions, what room we have in different sectors to actually reduce those emissions to hit that goal. And this, I think, is a really great chart that kind of summarizes their thinking. So here you'll see, it takes my eyes a minute to focus on what these numbers mean, but you'll see the 4 main sectors here, the emissions in 1990, emissions in 2017, and then projected emissions in 2030, which is a range. And you can see just by using the strategies in the CECP, the Baker administration thinks we can get to 45 to 48% reduction in emissions by 2030. And I'll just draw your attention to that big arrow. The biggest opportunity is in the building sector. I think we agree with the Baker administration on that. That's where there's the most potential to reduce emissions in comparison to the other sectors. So just this is similar to the graph I showed before, but I think it's just an easier visualization of it. This is where our emissions reductions come from. Sorry, this is where our emissions reduction opportunities come from. It's slightly more than a third of the opportunity comes from the building sector, with a significant amount coming from the transportation sector as well. We've done a lot of work in the electric sector. There's still more opportunity, but you can see clearly that there's less opportunity there. And I think this is actually where I'm going to pass it off to Sarah to talk about some of our critiques. Jump to the next section here.
Great. Thank you so much, Jacob. Welcome, everybody. And in this section, just going to go over sort of a big picture of where there is room for improvement for the CECP 2030 plan, and sort of keep these talking points in mind as we move through the 4 different sections of the document in upcoming slides. So the very first opportunity for improvement or critique is that each plan, that the plan itself and the sections themselves should really lead with an equity focus. And what that means specifically, we'll dive into later on, but really as a coalition, Mass Power Forward is really centering the voices, the experiences, and an energy future on frontline communities. Our second critique is that we need to be very specific around setting targets, around having measurable outcomes, and move away from the verbs that say explore, investigate, and really honing in on actions that are measurable and therefore holds the Baker administration to some form of accountability in terms of achieving progress over time. The third critique is that as an overall document, we really need to outline funding sources for all of the work that we think is important and necessary. And as this document is written now, that's not as clear as it could be. And so we're going to talk through some recommendations sector by sector in upcoming slides. And lastly, this is, I'm sure all of you have been keeping tabs on this, the 2030 emissions target. It's not fast enough and it's not deep enough. So instead of a 45 to 48% emissions target goal, why not 50? What does the climate bill say right now in the latest version? So keep that in mind as well. So I actually do not have advancing privileges. So could somebody advance the slide for me? Thank you. So I want to talk about centering equity in the CECP. And for many of us who have been advocates for a long time, and for those of us who are coming into the climate movement as the recent advocate, I think it's important to really think about what this concept means. And especially for people that live in communities that have been dominated by polluting industry with really poor housing stock and in places that have been chronically underinvested in. In other words, these environmental justice communities where people pay way more for their utility bills compared to the more affluent white communities. So what we offer is that these are the communities, the environmental justice communities are those that stand the most to benefit because they have been burdened for extended periods of time. And part of centering equity really focuses on removing those barriers for low-income folks to receive the benefits, for example, of new technologies, and to provide incentives either through tax credits or through rebate programs to increase access for Black and Brown households that live in environmental justice communities. And people that live in these communities really suffer. We've seen this so dramatically this year during the pandemic. a lot of significant comorbidities, some significant mortality rates in environmental justice communities, especially for those folks, Black and brown folks that live near hotspots of air pollution and suffer from upper respiratory ailments. We're disproportionately susceptible, and more of those folks died from COVID than white folks living in more affluent communities where the air was less toxic. In addition, in order for us to reach our 100% renewable energy vision of the future, we will need to really have in place funding streams to help low-income households transition to new technologies like cladding out of Denmark that is part of a particular kind of weatherization, air source heat pumps, air sealing where you just plug all the leaks in very leaky homes, as well as induction cook stoves. So all of those kinds of energy efficiency technologies are available, and we need to make them more available to low-income folks. Moreover, we really want to expand our ecosystem of what it means to have a low energy, zero emissions future. And that means we need a workforce that is trained, and we need to offer people transitioning out of the fossil fuel based industry workforce into the clean energy workforce. And so this is super important and part of our strategy around centering equity as part of our comments and recommendations for improving the CECP 2030. Next slide, please. I want to offer a visual. I'm a visual learner, and when I see a text-heavy slide, I just kind of check out. So here, this is for all of us visual learners. And so when we talk about equity, what we're really talking about are structural barriers that are in the energy system, like any other system, that prevent equality. And so people often say to me, Sarah, what's the difference between equity and equality? And this graphic, I think, is helpful. So starting on the far left, you can see we have different heights of people, and the really short person, despite everyone having an equal box of resources to support them, still cannot see through the blocked off fence line to the Red Sox game. And that Red Sox game is actually an energy efficiency program. It's a solar rebate program. It's an electric vehicle rebate program, whatever the thing is. The point is that there are structural barriers in place that prevent people that start out under-resourced, that start out from suffering from decades of discriminatory practices. So we don't all start off necessarily on the same, with the same capacity, the same resources, and the same lived experience. Okay, however, a lot of well-intended advocates, a lot of programs and plans are in place to try to fix that problem, to try to actually get the shorter person taller up. And so we put more and more resources under that shorter person. So finally, at some point, they're able to see over the fence. They're able to access an energy efficiency program with more ease. However, the structural barrier is still in place, right? So if we take those boxes away, that little person and probably the middle height person, they won't have access. They won't see the Red Sox win. What we're trying to get to is this far right part of the triptych where everyone can see the game. Everyone has access to deep energy retrofits, and there are no structural barriers in place. We can all see through this fence, regardless of our height, regardless of our race and gender identity. That's what we're trying to get to at the end of the day. Next slide, please. So this idea of energy equity is really important when we're thinking through this plan. Very broadly, it's defined as the fair distribution of benefits and burdens from how we produce and consume energy. And just as a contrast, a study in contrast, the town of Acton, the median household income tops at around, median is the middle, tops at around 120,000. And only 3% of those households have limited English proficiency. So meaning there are very few folks that speak a different language as their primary language. And some 46% of those homes have participated in some kind of energy efficiency program. Compare that to Fall River, where 65% of the homes are renter occupied, which poses unique challenges to accessing energy efficiency programs and solar energy, any kind of renewable energy. And the median income is half of the statewide average, and only 13% of people living in Fall River have taken advantage of any kind of energy efficiency program. So there are structural barriers in our energy system. You all know this. Next slide, please. Energy equity is actually, falls under this broader category of energy justice, where energy justice says, once again, we are explicitly centering the frontline communities, their concerns, their experiences, their needs, in order to make energy more clean energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency programs more accessible, affordable, and democratically managed. So this means the goal, an energy justice goal, is about making sure that there are programs and policies in place to address and reverse how harms are produced over time. So we're really talking about remediating past harms so that future harms do not happen. Next slide, please. There are 3 forms of energy justice that I have found to be helpful in thinking about how to frame comments and recommendations relative to the CECP 2030 document. The first form of energy justice is called procedural justice. Does the recommendation, does the CECP policy idea, does it center decision-making within frontline communities? So the key consideration here is who is making the decision? Who is benefiting from that decision? And are there recommendations that you as advocates can make in the different sections of the CECP 2030 document that do center frontline communities having a direct say over their energy future? Next slide, please. The second form of energy justice is called distributional justice. And this refers explicitly to how the benefits are distributed, as well as how is access distributed. And so, for example, in terms of benefits, does the CECP policy guideline or does your recommendation center the economic, the social, or the health benefits for frontline communities? And likewise, does the CECP 2030 recommendation, policy recommendation, or does your recommendations to improve it, does it make energy more accessible and more affordable to frontline communities? And so the key thing here is really considering whether the policies benefit or excuse me, I get so excited about this, I jump ahead. One of the key things is to really consider how a particular CECP policy guideline benefits and harms other parts of where energy touches our lives. So for example, in terms of thinking about deep energy retrofits, are there dangers or are there omissions around tenant protections once retrofits have been made? And one recommendation you could offer is that there be tenant protections in place for all deep energy retrofits so that the threat of displacement is minimized. Next slide, please. The third form of energy justice is called representational justice. And this is about, frankly, are we seeing Black and Brown environmental justice residents employed in education programs, being trained in workforce development, upskilling programs? Are we seeing Black and Brown EJ residents on task forces, commissions, and other decision-making entities? So this is really about where are frontline community residents being represented in various parts of our energy ecosystem. Next slide, please. So this is something that Jacob pointed to earlier. The 2030 target as stated in the CECP 2030 plan, points to 45% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions relative to the 1990 base level. This is not strong enough. And frankly, the climate bill with its 50% target goal is much stronger. So the CECP, one recommendation right off the bat you could make is let's strengthen this 2030 reductions target relative to 1990 levels. And some of the justifications for this start with the 2018 IPCC report that says global minimum emissions reductions have to be 50% in order to avert the worst impacts of climate change. And that here in the Commonwealth, this is a highly educated, really motivated group of residents with some wealth, technological savvy, and a lot of startups in terms of clean tech to really start ramping up the ability, the capacity to really meet a 50% reductions goal. Please keep in mind this third point, that emissions is not the emissions over time is not a linear relationship, right? The first 20% emissions reductions, as outlined in the CECP 2030 document, requires far less effort than the last. And we're saying, wait a minute, we have time now, we've got money, we've got motivation. Let's ramp up this first 20% part of this relationship. So this means that we need to think about some specific policies and mechanisms to help us ramp this accelerated reductions target timeline. And one way to do that is with a net zero stretch code, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The world is going in this direction. The Commonwealth cannot be left behind, especially when we tie this first 20% reduction time period to the creation of jobs and the upskilling of fossil fuel-based industry workers. So keep in mind, the climate bill has a 50% reductions goal by 2030. So we need to get these two documents in better alignment. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, here on this slide, you'll have links to what Jacob was talking about in terms of the scenarios outlined in the roadmap, and then the actual CECP 2030 document itself. It's a very interesting read. It's really heavy on market-based logic. Something else to keep in mind. Comments are due by Monday. That's not a lot of time, but there is still time if you are so motivated. And one of our last slides will give you contact information about who amongst the panel to follow up with if you want to coordinate comments. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take this section up. This is about our buildings and heating systems. Next slide, please. There are a couple of challenges that I think it's useful to locate the CECP 2030 document in. One of the challenges is that folks that live in environmental justice communities and gateway cities, excuse me, really continue to suffer from really poor housing stock, poor quality housing stock, very drafty, with gas powered cook stoves that create, luckily they're drafty enough that indoor air quality, it's still not great, and that they are heavily utility burdened, which means that they pay a lot of their monthly income to maintain their utilities. And that's a problem because these houses are so inefficient. So this is one particular challenge that as a coalition, we really want to lift up and prioritize in all of our recommendations to the CECP 2030 plan. We have a lot of buildings, 3 million residential buildings and over 1 billion square feet of commercial real estate already built. That's a lot of stock to think about. So thinking about retrofits and that the building stock and heating systems, we don't want to lock in our buildings to be continuously emitting carbon. So we need to think about how to quickly fund and switch out emitting technologies and drop in low carbon, zero emission technologies that include insulation, electrification, and renewables. Unfortunately, the vast majority of our building stock is currently heated with gas, oil, or propane. That's the reality. That's the challenge. And in addition, we need to really think about how to ramp up a well-paid, protected, trained workforce to help us make this just transition. Next slide, please. So this is what the CECP document itself is recommending in terms of this particular this particular section of the document, that the Department of Energy Resources will present what they call a new high performance stretch code to the entity that promulgates this code. And that entity is the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, the BBRS, in the year 2021. And this will allow municipalities that are designated as green communities to opt in to this high performance stretch code starting in January 22. And that this stretch code, so y'all know there's a base code that's sort of a minimum building code that has standards associated with. So a building code says, this is what you need to do, and the standards give you specific details on how to do it. So there's a base code, and then there's a stretch code that goes above and beyond as technologies improve, as materials innovate over time. And what the CECP document is calling for is a high performance stretch code. They're ambiguous about what that really means. A high performance stretch code could basically mean a really super efficient building completely powered by gas, because a high performance is all about efficiency. Okay, so keep that in mind. The idea with the high performance stretch code is that ultimately it will become mandatory according to the CECP 2030, no later by 2028, so that it would roll into what would become the new base code. All right. The document also recommends for buildings phasing out and ending all fossil fuel heating incentives by the end of 2024. And thirdly, expanding consumer incentives for increasing access to clean heating technology, especially for low and moderate income residents. So there's a little bit of equity right there. In addition, the CECP recommends convening a commission and a task force on clean heat right around the corner in May 2021. And that mass DEP will develop and implement by the year 2023 a long-term declining emissions cap on heating fuels, which is really essential. Next slide, please. So these are our recommendations in response to what the CECP outlined. So the first recommendation that we have is really about setting mandatory greenhouse gas emissions reductions limits on the building sector statewide by the year 2022, with enforcement starting a few years later in 2025. In addition to that, we propose setting a declining limit on emitted carbon dioxide from heating fuel suppliers. And this is not addressed explicitly in the CECP 2030 plan. Thirdly, investing in a comprehensive, and this is really important, thinking about all that building stock, investing in a comprehensive whole homes retrofits, specifically focused on low and moderate income households and small businesses. And this includes making sure that these buildings are able to be retrofitted. So that's called pre-weatherization. Fixing roofs, making sure that buildings are structurally sound, dropping in insulation, thinking about windows, and thinking about electrification. So that's our first recommendation. Our second recommendation is to adopt a non-combustion. That's really important language right here, given the vagueness about the high performance efficiency code. A non-combustion, high efficiency, net zero opt-in stretch code That's a mouthful. I'm going to talk about this in more detail in a minute. This would be a municipal opt-in by 2022, next year. And then it would be adopted statewide no later than 2025. So we're trying to ramp that up. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit. I think Eben's on the call tonight. Here you go, Eben. There are 3 piers to a net zero buildings foundation. So the first pier is really about these energy efficiency technologies. And we want to make sure the building envelope is tight, that there's very little ventilation. So we're not losing heat during winter and we're not losing coolness during summer or cool air. And these energy efficiency technologies include air source heat pumps that basically can extract warmth from the outside air, even in very cold temperatures, and transfer that warmth as heat to water, for example, for hot water heaters. It also includes a really super efficient appliances that are electric, that are not powered by natural gas or oil or propane. So we need this energy efficiency as the starting point. We need electrification as another essential part of the pier to a net zero building, right? Remember one of those slides that Jacob showed, we really want to get the sources of electric energy to be increasingly from solar, wind, and other forms of clean energy. Renewable energy is the third pier. And the definition of a net zero building is a building that generates as much renewable energy as it consumes from non-renewable sources. So we need renewable energy source either on-site or procured off-site. And this is super important. So it's very important to actually be clear about what a net zero building is and what a net zero stretch code offers the construction industry to work with them. Next slide, please. So moving on, other recommendations in this section include, again, we're trying to specify targets here, establishing participation targets for the mass save programs focused on underrepresented kinds of customers and residents, including moderate income ratepayers, renters, a really important category of energy users, those with limited English proficiency, small businesses, and once again, EJ communities. Moreover, we want to align the mass save programs with decarbonization goals, right? To remove all incentives for fossil fuel appliances and to put in other incentives to turn over those appliances before they reach their end of life. Next slide, please. These 3 recommendations are really meaty and super important. The first one is about these whole home deep weatherization building electrification programs. So once again, we are talking about how to make homes, especially old homes, poor quality housing stock, and environmental justice communities in low income and moderate income households, how to make them ready to be retrofitted. Okay, and how to do a deep energy retrofit. And we really recommend setting clear policy directives to lower barriers specifically to electrification for these populations by the year 2022, a year from now. Second point, we absolutely need to create a workforce development program to train architects, builders, tradespeople, knob and tube folks, as well as building inspectors. We can't forget that group of folks to install and operate net zero buildings and electrified buildings. Thirdly, really directing the Department of Public Utilities to develop a comprehensive and equitable methane gas transition plan. And this has come out, docket 2080, for those of you who know that, is really about how can the state work with the natural gas distribution companies to figure out what is their role as we decarbonize and head towards a just transition in the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. Lastly, we have to pay for this. We all have to pay some way or another. The CECP 2030 document right now is very vague on funding. And so it's up to us as advocates to say, hey, here's an idea. let us think about establishing a large-scale statewide, either a financing program or a climate bank, with the goal being to fund the decarbonization of the building sector to make it devoid of fossil fuels by the year 2025. So again, we're trying to ramp up and accelerate this, initial decarbonization part of the trend. This has to include ample funding for deep energy retrofits. Think of all that square footage of residential buildings and to draw from what's already being done in New York, which is based on what's being done in Denmark, and think about equitable workforce development programs and projects that advance not only climate-friendly buildings, healthy buildings that are non-emitting, but that also allow us to adjust and adapt to our changing local conditions over time. Thirdly, that we, in establishing this climate bank, that the barriers to decarbonizing buildings be removed in other policies and other funding streams. So the Community Preservation Act, how might we think about changes to that particular fund to perhaps fund more decarbonization of buildings through this particular pot of money, especially, yes, exactly, Ida, especially the older historic building stock. Really tough nut there to crack, but it's possible. And we have some ideas about how to do that. Likewise for public schools. Next slide, please. So this is the headline. These are sort of the top shelf, top line recommendations for all of you to ponder. And again, very quickly, centering equity. We want to lead with that. And those three different definitions of energy justice might be useful for all of you. Secondly, really thinking about, okay, we need a net zero opt-in stretch code. Be that precise, that specific, with the goal being a statewide, or having it roll into the base code statewide by the year 2025. Creating a workforce development and training programs, working in collaboration with labor to make sure these are well-paying jobs, workers are protected, that we are creating a thriving clean energy sector. Stop all fossil fuel incentives through mass save by 2022. This is pretty easy. Let's just stop it and create a climate bank to fund the transition. Lastly, setting these mandatory reduction limits on the building sector statewide by 2022, with enforcement starting a few years later. And we're going to do this in a variety of different ways that I have described. So with that, that's the buildings and heating section. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic, I believe, to Veena.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Next slide, please. I will be speaking about the transportation sector priorities in the CECP. Next slide, Jacob. Thank you. So before we dive into the policies of the CECP, let's see what the key challenges are when it comes to the transportation sector. As with all other sectors, environmental justice populations bear the burden of transportation-related air pollution, and as well as the public health impacts that come with it. And for the large part, they do not contribute to these problems. At the same time, I would say environmental justice communities also have inequitable access to transportation options, whether it's public transit or it's sidewalks on their streets or bike lanes. Often you would see all of this in wealthier communities. Second, transportation is the largest source of emissions in the state. I think in Massachusetts, it accounts to almost 43% of the emissions, and these emissions are continuing to increase. A big reason for this increase is that the vehicle miles traveled, as well as the vehicle sizes that people are buying, the kind of cars that people are buying. This has largely offset the emission benefits from stricter federal fuel efficiency standards. And because of that, we don't see a related benefit of emission reductions. Third, and this is a big challenge when it comes to transportation, is that both passenger vehicles as well as truck fleets, it takes almost 20 years or more to turn over that fleet. And it makes it very difficult to decarbonize that sector. So once you have a new car or a new truck on the road, it effectively means for the next 15 or 20 years or more, that particular vehicle is going to be adding to the air pollution. So it's very important to make sure that with each opportunity, if there are people buying a new vehicle, we want to make it attractive enough for them to make sure that they're buying an electric vehicle, for example. Fourth, while vehicle electrification is a part of the solution, it's very, very important to understand that that alone is not going to be enough to lower emissions from the sector. We'll speak a little bit more about this, but the CECP, focuses a lot on electrification. That in itself is not bad, but we need to be doing much more. For example, we need to be expanding transit access. We need more active transportation and micro-mobility options across the state. So we'll cover a little bit about this in the next few slides. And finally, high upfront costs, as well as the lack of widespread access to charging infrastructure, remains a big barrier and a challenge when it comes to electric vehicle adoption. And this is something that needs to be addressed in the next, I think, 5 or 6 years pretty effectively if we are to make any change in public health as well as emission reductions when it comes to transportation. Next slide, please. This slide covers the key transportation policies in the draft CECP. First is implementing cap and invest policies like the Transportation and Climate Initiative Program by 2023, as well as a low carbon fuel standard by 2026. Second is the electrification of the light duty sector. It's a key focus in the CECP when it comes to reducing emissions, and they're looking to deploy at least 1 million electric vehicles in the next decade. So if you have a look at the Decarbonization Roadmap, you'll see a lot of the modeling that they have done is just focused on this light duty vehicle sector. And they're completely depending on this sector and people buying EVs to be able to reduce emissions. Again, a good policy by itself, but it's not enough. We need much more. The third thing is the state is going to adopt zero emission vehicle mandates that are designed or coordinated by California, like the California Advanced Clean Car Standard that would require all light duty vehicles to be electric by 2035. It would also adopt the California Advanced Clean Truck Rule, which would require automakers to increase the sales of electric trucks in the state. And under a separate MOU, Massachusetts is also committed to 30% of all new truck and bus sales being zero emission by 2030, and 100% of these sales being electric by 2050. So this section kind of includes a lot of commitments that Massachusetts has already made, but the key factor to note here that it'll be a few years before these policies can actually be implemented. And the reason why that is we'll go more into details when we enter the recommendations section. The next policy strategy looks at programs and incentives that will help lower the upfront cost of purchasing EVs and making EVs more accessible. Next is building out the ZEV charging infrastructure that will make public charging stations more accessible and exploring smart charging options that residents across the state could use to charge their cars during off-peak rates. Currently, it's not that widespread, and it would be an important factor as the percentage of EVs in our state keeps increasing. There's also a policy strategy around educating and raising consumer awareness about the benefits of EVs, the incentives that are available, as well as implementing a whole lot of pilot programs to encourage market development. we definitely need more than pilots. All this is important, but we need to be doing more implementation than pilots. And finally, there is a policy that talks about stabilizing vehicle miles traveled and promoting smart growth policies, which is strange because the plan doesn't talk anything about expanding transit. So it would be very difficult to achieve smart growth policies without transit, without walking and biking infrastructure, which is completely absent in the plan. Next slide, please. Let's actually dive into what our recommendations are when it comes to transportation policies. So the CECP identifies 6 main strategies, and under each strategy, the plan proposes a number of actions that we've evaluated to come up with the following recommendations. And overall recommendation, like Sarah just spoke about, is that all the policy strategy actions in the plan should be more target oriented. They should list specific goals that will be achieved in the next decade instead of just exploring and investigating program ideas. A glaring omission in the CECP is the complete lack of focus on transit. I think the most important recommendation in the transportation sector is that the state should improve and expand public transit systems so that we can get people to shift away from cars and move to transit and move to active transportation options like walking and biking for shorter trips around their community. Our recommendation is to reduce and not just stabilize vehicle miles traveled. An accessible, reliable, and expanded transit system combined with smart growth policies like affordable mixed-use development near transit is going to be central when we are promoting a mode shift. And we want to reduce VMTs. Without doing this, it would be very difficult. Also, there are several core benefits, including reducing traffic congestion and carbon emissions and improving public health outcomes. We are also going to be expanding economic opportunity for those without personal vehicles. I think just depending on electrification and telecommuting, which is a strategy that's mentioned in the CECP, that's not going to result in substantial VMT reductions. And in many cases, it would exacerbate inequities. For example, the telecommuting policy means that, affluent people that can work from home would be able to benefit from this policy, but essential workers that need to travel to their jobs, to grocery stores, to if they're transit workers, they won't be able to make use of these policies. So by its very nature, it is not very equitable. A related recommendation and something that's not in the plan is establishing 100% interim and fleet electrification targets. So we are asking that transit bus fleets and school bus fleets be electric by 2030. The commuter rail service, especially the service that runs in EJ communities, be electric by 2024, and the entire system be electric by 2035. And finally, state and municipal fleets should be electric by 2035. Next slide, please. For those who are not familiar with TCI, it is a multi-state cap and invest program for transportation emissions that's very similar to RGGI. Currently, there are 4 jurisdictions, including Massachusetts, that have signed on to an MOU to implement TCI. And this program is going to begin in 2023. So we're still 2 years away. What we want the state to do and what our recommendation is that we should start the equity work before 2023. And we should commit to establishing an equity advisory board, which is required by the MOU, but we should get that up and running by the summer of 2021. And we should ensure that a majority of the appointed members actually represent overburdened and underserved communities. And Massachusetts should also immediately start implementing complementary policies like a low-income fare program, install air monitoring stations in communities with a focus on EJ communities, and also start implementing congestion pricing. Next, the Commonwealth should commit to increasing investments of all the proceeds that we get through TCI in EJ communities, and move that from the base of 35 to at least 70%. And together with that, I think they should release a detailed plan for public engagement to determine just how all these revenue is going to be spent, what kind of projects, and the process for communities to qualify for these funds. On the low carbon fuel standards that would be implemented by 2026 again, what the low carbon fuel standard is that it deploys low carbon substitutes for petroleum-based transportation fuels. And so it's essentially biofuels. So we are asking the state to provide details of what those biofuels under consideration are, what the safeguards are related to their transportation and storage, as it's most likely that a lot of it will be transported by rail or road, and it would contribute to existing air pollution levels in EJ communities. And also in the case of LCFS, we want the state to commit to an early and meaningful public engagement process, particularly with EJ populations. This was not done in TCI, and there were a lot of lessons learned through TCI that we need to make sure that when we're implementing LCFS, that's taken into account. Next, please. The policies in this, or the policy on this slide, there are a lot of details in it. So let me start with a brief introduction. So while we support the decision for Massachusetts to adopt California's Advanced Clean Car Standard and the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, as well as the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule, what's important to note is that some of these standards are still being written, and it is dependent on California getting a waiver, which means that implementation of all these different rules is possible only later in the decade. I would say more likely in the second half of this decade. So we recommend that in the interim, Massachusetts should commit to developing and implementing a suite of policies and programs to accelerate EV adoption. We should not wait for California to pass these rules before starting work on this. Second, the Commonwealth is committed to adopting both the multi-state medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle MOU, as well as the Advanced Clean Truck Rule. Both these policies actually pertain to the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector. And it's important to note that while the number of medium and heavy duty vehicles on our streets are significantly lower than, for example, passenger vehicles, this sector actually contributes much more to the pollution levels. So what we want to recommend is that Massachusetts adopt the higher sales targets of the ACT rule and commit to 50% of the sales being electric by 2030 and 100% of sales being electric by 2045, which is 5 years faster than the goal that is there in the MOU. So if we set this ambitious targets, we'll be able to work on the policies and rebates and incentives that are necessary to make this transition smoother. The CECP, again, focuses on the electrification of the light duty sector. And while this is positive news, we want to recommend that the state also prioritize the electrification of the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector in this decade, instead of just limiting it to pilot projects. And they should start with the electrification of transit and school buses. And this is because the model availability for other medium and heavy duty vehicles is continuing to develop. So starting with transit and school buses makes perfect sense because this the technology for those vehicle categories are already pretty mainstream. Next slide, please. The recommendations on this slide are related to incentive programs that will make EVs more accessible both to individuals as well as to state and municipal agencies. Our recommendation is that the more EV rebate is provided at the car dealership by 2021. Currently, people have to wait several months after they've actually purchased their vehicle to get the rebate, and there's a fair amount of paperwork involved. So we want this process to be streamlined and the rebate to be available at the point of purchase, which will encourage more people to consider EVs when they are in the market for a car. We also want the state to implement a point of sale rebate program for moderate and low income residents to purchase both new as well as used EVs by 2022. EVs by its very nature currently is accessible to a very narrow segment of the population today. If we want to make it more accessible to many more people, we need to make sure that this policy for low-income residents is put in place as soon as possible with higher incentive levels for them, especially if they belong to, or live in an EJ community. And finally, we need to establish a group purchasing program by 2021 to lower the cost for state and municipal ZEV procurements. Next, please. The recommendations in this slide are related to expanding the deployment of public as well as residential and workplace charging infrastructure across the state. The CECP says that Massachusetts will need to deploy 1 million light-duty vehicles in the next decade, even if you were not looking at just the light-duty vehicle sector. But we're looking at the municipal and other private fleets. We need to make sure that charging stations are as easily accessible as gas stations are today. And without that, it would be impossible to reach that goal. So it's very, very important that we set a numeric target for the number of charging stations that we need to build in the next decade to meet these goals. Second, instead of just exploring and we should require that utilities analyze alternative rate structures and the barriers that are related to DCFC stations in 2021. And by 2022, they should commit that, by they, I mean utilities. Utilities should commit to implementing time-varying rates as well as residential charging incentive programs by 2022. What this will do is that it will encourage people to charge overnight or at other beneficial times during the day. And why this is very critical to do it as soon as possible is because as the number of EVs increase, EV charging could potentially increase electric loads during certain hours, and that might require more infrastructure upgrades to the electric grid, resulting in increased costs for the ratepayer. We want to minimize this. And what alternative rate structures will do is that it will encourage charging during periods of time when the demand on the grid are low, or maybe during periods of time when there are high renewable energy productions. At the same time, we need to ensure that low and moderate income consumers do not bear an unfair share of the costs for these time of use rates. And we need to ensure that they have access to benefits from such rates. Next slide. And finally, our top line recommendations. I'll be very brief. If there was just one transportation recommendation, I say that it should be the first one, and that's expand and improve transit as well as active transportation and micro mobility options across the state. And it should be in combination with transit-oriented development, things like multifamily zoning that will help us reduce vehicle miles traveled. We need to set 100% electrification targets for transit, school buses, commuter rail, as well as municipal and state fleets. We need to develop and implement a suite of policies, not just one or two, but several, that are specific to different vehicle categories. Medium and heavy duty vehicle sector, TNCs, which means, ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft, as well as delivery fleets, as well as fleets with other very high vehicle miles traveled. And finally, we need to offer the more EV rebate at the point of purchase, as well as implement moderate and low income rebate for residents to purchase as new as well as used EVs by 2022. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jacob.
Thanks, Veena. I am going to skim through the electric sector pretty quickly. oops, just because we're running a little short on time, although we're doing okay. And I think that the meat of what we want to talk about were in the building and transportation sectors. This, as we pointed out in the beginning, there is slightly less potential in the energy sector, the electricity sector, to reduce emissions. I'm going to zip through this pretty quick. So first of all, just talking about some of the challenges in the electric sector, very similar to the other sectors. I think the main theme is inequity of access. Another wrinkle in the electric sector is also where we build our energy generating facilities and energy infrastructure. Disproportionately, they are built in low-income communities and communities of color. I think just maybe the prime example of inequity of access is when we look at the Mass Save program. There's a recent report that came out, Mass Save, that showed it disproportionately benefits affluent majority white communities, and that communities that actually might benefit the most, where there's the least wealth and least access to these energy efficiency technologies, are receiving almost no benefits. But I'll move us along here. So a lot of what you'll hear in the electric sector is a lot of what we've talked about in Mass Power Forward. We want to essentially expand the renewable energy, especially Class 1 renewable energy in Massachusetts, and also clean up the definition of what it means to be renewable. So that means really expanding our solar programs and especially offshore wind. There's an enormous potential in Massachusetts for offshore wind. Excuse me. And also notably, I see some folks from MLP towns on the call. This also means decarbonizing municipal light plant towns, folks like Holyoke Gas and Electric, who generate their own renewables locally in their municipality. I will also just say there's an issue for Sierra Club, sourcing power and imports. We are in a very different place than the Baker administration in regard to importing hydropower. They really see that as a part of their energy mix going forward, where we really preference not large hydro. It's incredibly damaging, and we did another webinar on that a couple of weeks ago, in fact. But really, local solar and wind that'll grow our local economy and generate jobs here in Massachusetts. So just a few more things that I didn't quite mention. I actually did get some of these, but there's also I think the other thing to pull out of this here, and I'm skipping over some of the bullets folks might notice, but please read at your leisure, is actually updating our grid itself to have a more distributed energy generation. So as we have more generation on people's homes or community solar, making our grid able to manage that kind of advanced network. Right now, it's very reliant on large generators that turn on and turn off, and that's just not what we're going to have going forward. It's going to be much more intermittent, and there are a lot of upgrades that need to happen around that. This ties in very closely with what Veena was saying earlier about charging electric vehicles at night, incentives for that kind of thing. So just being smarter with how we administer our electric sector, also expanding renewable sources rapidly. All right. So again, this has been a theme throughout. Making sure we're protecting our vulnerable communities. I talked a second ago about how Mass Save is predominantly benefits from Mass Save predominantly go to wealthy white communities, and that's true for pretty much all Massachusetts programs. Including the Mass Solar Loan Program and Heat Smart, which is defunct now, but provided access to clean heating technologies. So really, this is a couple of things here. We need to remove the financial barriers. It's very difficult for renters to participate in some of these programs, not to mention low-income people. And also, education and outreach. A lot of these materials are predominantly in English, administered by the Baker administration, which isn't known for its outreach into EJ communities. And really doing more than that, carving out specific goals within these programs for low-income access and making that part of the metric for success of the program. If the only goal is, install X number, do X number of home retrofits, then the contractors and the program administrators who are charged with doing that are going to pick the easiest homes, and those are always going to be wealthy communities who have money to work with the contractors administrators. So yeah, I think that says it all right there. I talked a little about Canadian hydro a second ago, but really that's not where we see non-emitting sources. That's not where we see Massachusetts sourcing non-emitting energy in the future. Sorry, that was a mouthful. Really preferencing solar and wind. Class 1 renewables should not include large hydro. And there's also Massachusetts is part of a regional grid. It's not, we don't just generate power in Massachusetts for Massachusetts. We're in a regional grid. ISO New England, folks may be familiar with that term. And the way that ISO New England is set up is, this is we could do another whole hour and a half webinar on ISO New England, but it really doesn't preference renewable energy. They're really set up to use large power generators, fossil fuel generators that turn on and turn off, like I said, to meet the energy demands of the region. So there needs to be a multi-state initiative to reform ISO New England so we can prepare it for the renewable energy future. Let's see here. Folks can tell I didn't write these slides, but I do know them somewhat. The next slide here, again, talks about some of the climate impacts that we expect to see. The term resiliency is commonly used to talk about a power grid that can withstand weather impacts, can withstand criminal actors, God forbid. But really, we need to think about what does it mean? What's it going to look like in 10 years when weather impacts are stressing our grid? Our country's seen a lot of this, even in the last few years, down in Texas most recently, really disastrous outcomes to extreme weather. So how can we prepare for that? And how can we protect the folks who will be most vulnerable in extreme weather or disaster situation? And knowing that our power grid is going to look very different from how it does today in the future, how can we also take that into account moving forward? And I should say that last slide at the bottom, those upgrades are obviously going to be expensive. Upgrading our power grid is going to cost a lot of money. We need to make sure that those costs do not fall on low and moderate incomes. They can't be funding for this transformation. I talked about cleaning up the grid, but this bullet really hits the nail on the head. We cannot consider biomass, which is wood burning for electricity, and solid waste combustion to be clean energy sources. And this has been a long fight, especially in the last couple of years. I think it's really bubbled to the surface in the legislature around what kind of incentives do these technologies get. And we really see a future in which both biomass and solid waste combustion do not receive the same incentives as things like solar and wind. They're not considered part of our what we consider clean energy. And hopefully, as we have more solar and wind come online, more zero emission sources, we can continue to phase out those generators as well. And certainly, we should be building new biomass facilities. Similarly, we need to really consider the health impacts of air pollutants resulting from our energy system right now. I would not, any study that I'm sure EEA did would conclude that the impacts fall on EJ communities, as we've seen anecdotally a lot recently. But really, I think we need some kind of greater tracking for all of these kind of pollution impacts as well, and public health impacts. So I told you I'd skim through this. I didn't want to take as much time as my co-presenters, who I think have much meatier sections. But just to kind of recap some of the main points here. Again, it's about scaling out our renewable energy sources. So expanding solar, expanding wind, and the legislature has already done some of this with the additional procurement for offshore wind and S9. I know solar is very complicated. I haven't been looking at the chat, but I know there's some comments earlier about solar siting. And I would just say we need to consistently incentivize solar in places like rooftops and parking lots and brownfields, and try and avoid cutting down trees. I know is an issue in some parts of the state. So it doesn't say it explicitly here, but I do want to mention that. And then really, again, clean up our energy portfolio, get rid of woody biomass and solid waste. Make sure there's equal access for folks who want to participate in our energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. And in fact, we believe that low income and below moderate income energy burden residents and residents of EJ communities should receive at least 50% of the statewide clean energy investment. So really, to the diagram that Sarah showed earlier, really investing in those communities up front as we try at the same time to change the system, update our grid for a clean energy future. Yeah, so I'm gonna move us to our closing here, but I do want to share a section that we're not going to cover tonight, which I forgot to show this slide here, but we're in the extra credit section right now. This just shows our anticipated electric sector emissions over from 1990 to anticipated 2030, but folks can check this out in their own time. As well as the information about the other industries and carbon sequestration. We just felt we didn't have time to cover this. There's less potential here. Folks remember the graph, the chart at the beginning. There's much less opportunity for emissions reduction in the sector. We do share, I did want to share a couple notes. I'm not going to read through this, but I'll share the slides. And I just want to note the top line around methane leaks. That's probably the most significant opportunity to reduce emissions in the non-energy and industrial sector. So I just want to block that out, but we'll share the slides and folks take a look at this. There's also another slide here we have on carbon sequestration policies for folks who are interested. I know there's organizations, I think like the Nature Conservancy and a couple others who are really diving deep into this, but we're just not, we don't have time to go over it tonight, unfortunately. So we are, I think, ready to move into next steps and closing. Thank you all for sticking around and listening to this data dump. I hope we hope we passed on a few helpful tidbits. So next steps. This is similar to the slide we shared before, but here are the links once more to the Decarbonization Roadmap, the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. And I didn't say this, but the CECP is very readable. It's not as long as you'd think. And if you're a nerd like me, I actually do recommend reading it. There's a lot of good stuff in there, although we did do a nice summary, so perhaps it'll be repetitive. Public comment is due on Monday. So I know that's coming up quick. Some groups have already submitted their comments to EEA. And we're happy to work with you if you want to submit comments. There are some great instructions on the website what format they want the comments in. Sierra Club, we're actually making an action alert for individuals who want to sign off on our comments. We did this for another regulatory process a couple years ago and got almost 800 comments in, and which did stand out to EEA. They actually posted them all on their website. So that is, one way to make your voice heard. If you're part of an organization that wants to submit comments, or if you are doing work related to municipal light plants, I definitely recommend talking to Sarah. MCAN is working on some, I think an organizational sign-on letter, and also some comments for municipal light plants. I didn't write this in the slide, but if you're a current municipal official, city council or select board member, something like that, either elected or appointed, we actually have a sign-on letter for those folks as well. We have about 50 folks sign on. We're hoping to get closer to 70 by the end of the public comment period. And Sarah, I don't know if you want to just say a few words about our resources page.
Thank you, Jacob. That was great. So we just wanted to add this slide that includes links for folks who are interested in learning more about how to apply the concepts around energy justice to thinking through any specific recommendations you want to submit, or also thinking through what the CECP document contains already. So there's an energy justice workbook. This has been put together by the Initiative for Energy Justice at our very own Northeastern University. It includes the Energy Justice Scorecard, which is the second embedded link there. In addition to those two resources, I highly recommend reading a very quick read by Dr. Shalonda Baker. She's now in the Biden administration as the, oh, Jacob, do you remember her title? The Energy Justice Director in DOE. I think that's
correct. Don't quote me on it.
Right. However, this is a really, really good book around the concepts of energy equity. Denise Fairchild and her colleague wrote another book, Energy Democracy. Again, really thinking about these different types of energy justice. And there are the Jimenez principles for organizing, democratic organizing, that is core to the Sierra Club's work. This is also a great resource for thinking about where to start with your comments and what is the larger frame within which to place your comments. And that is our resources slide.
And that is actually our presentation. This is our contact info. And I just quickly scrolled through the chat. A lot of questions about follow-up and public comments. So what we're going to do is, luckily, you all registered through our Zoom link. So I have all of your emails, thank goodness. What would I do without technology? So we will send out the slide deck and the Zoom recording to everyone. I'm going to aim to do it by tomorrow morning. Really make it a top priority for myself, where tomorrow morning isn't secretly Friday. But so we'll send out the slide deck. We'll send out the recording. We'll also include some links and bullets for folks who want to sign on to the various sign-on or comment letters we mentioned, to make it really easy for you all to follow up. And hopefully that will answer a lot of your questions. And I would just say, feel free to pull from the slide deck into your own comments. And we'll also link, I'll also link the resources page in the follow-up email as well. So don't worry about losing that. But yeah, feel free to pull from our comments. Our organizations, I think Sierra Club is going to be providing comments on all the sectors. I know MCAN is only doing, I think, the buildings and electric sector, maybe. I'm not sure, but comments don't need to, Sarah can correct me, comments don't need to address all sectors of the CECP. Even broad level comments are valuable.